Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the third segment of our fifth episode, focusing on SEL and the ways in which we measure its impact on our students. But before we turn to Maria and ATIBA to continue the conversation with Jon Eyler, I want to remind you all to subscribe below if you like what you hear and want to learn more about various topics centered around education. Or feel free to tune in live every Thursday at 7 p.m. We hope you enjoy and happy holidays.
John, the onset of the pandemic threw a lot of stuff at us. And at the same time, we had the killing of George Floyd, the marches, the demonstrations, the responses, and so forth. In terms of SEL and the challenges there, do you see a connection of what is happening socially in terms of issues of equity and so forth, and at the same time, what is happening with regards to the impact of the pandemic? And if so, what are they and how are they being addressed?
What a great question. I think the direct answer is there a connection? Absolutely. We've been heavily involved in equity work, and I know that carries a lot of different definitions, and especially in the last several months. And I would say foundational to being able to engage in, to lead equity work is social emotional competencies. At the core, whether you look at, I have a partnership with Dr. Eddie Fergus, who does a lot in the space of equity and disproportionality, and Dr. Nancy Delm is another partner. And the three of us have really kind of explored this concept of what we're calling EQI, equity intelligence. So we measure IQ, we measure EQ. EQI is equity intelligence. And that my ability to really understand, empathize, be responsive, understand how I show up in a situation is really contingent upon not just a headspace or a cognitive understanding, but also a set of lived experiences. And so if I haven't had, for example, if most of my interactions with people who are different from me racially or ethnically, linguistically, sexual orientation, you name it, if I've had a pretty homogeneous upbringing, I'm not really going to have a lens that's able to see how other people experience life differently than I do, or even how I show up to these other people. And so the interaction, the space of being able to pull people together, to have them interact in ways that they wouldn't have typically interacted, I think is key to developing what we're calling equity intelligence. And it's like this intersection of kind of being culturally responsive and also these set of social emotional competencies, primarily around individual awareness and social awareness. How do you create that? How do you grow that? And a lot of, the way that we're responding in similar fashion to SEL, we're going to teach it, right? We're going to go, section 5 or chapter 5, lesson 3. We're going to teach you cultural responsiveness. There's value to that. There's need for that, but that's not enough because in many cases, it is all cognitive and it remains here. It doesn't really get at the hard experiences. And so on my personal journey with equity, one of the most, I think, encouraging pieces for me has been, intentional interactions with people who have a different walk than I do have made me much more aware of their set of lived experiences. And I can very much be much more alongside them in terms of seeing that, feeling that, experiencing it. The other thing it's done is, obviously we're very divided as a country around this issue, if you will. Race, racism, equity, it's very politically divisive. For someone to say racism doesn't exist, or this type of disparity doesn't exist, I now have, through my experiences, I can say, yes, I've experienced that with my colleague. I've experienced it with my, you know what I'm saying? So it positions me better to be able to speak to that and address, well, what makes you, think that? It's kind of this, curiosity. We call it compassionate dialogue is another strategy to that. So I could talk forever about that piece, and there's a lot of passion behind it. But in short, is there a connection between social emotional competencies and equity work? Absolutely. I think one doesn't exist without the other. And I think you've got to invest in social emotional competencies in people to be able to create a system, a school system that is both equitable and responsive to trauma, responsive to culture. You've got to have these foundational SEL competencies.
Wow. There you go. I'm telling you, he just went ahead and Threw it at you, Jon. That's why we have ATIBA where he is. He just comes in and out, you know,
Behind the
dropping on
camera.
in.
Behind the camera.
Yeah, they're great questions though. And I love
Thanks.
So, you know, we're working out of DC. We're a national organization. Both ATIBA and I have the, you know, the humble blessing to be able to lead the work here. So, you know, when we talk about everything that we've had this short amount of time just to scratch the surface on, at a federal level, what should be a priority ask of the new administration for education, specifically of the new Secretary of Education? What's that ask when we're talking about this is a priority, this needs to be interwoven, we're talking about really that investment? What do you think we should be asking at a federal level?
It's a tough question, because I think often the go-to is like more money, more time to train, you know, more people. And what's interesting, and you know, a lot of the work that I've been involved with are education agencies more on the western side of the states. And so one state specifically, California, had a change in funding formula many years ago, and it basically freed up a lot of these kind of constrained funds around how you can use funds. And it also infused additional funds into school systems. And that was kind of the go-to. That was the trend. It's like, we're going to buy people, we're going to put them around kids, and we're going to do SEL and mental health and what have you. And those, they're great, but there's also a lot of inefficiencies that I see in that. And I think part of it is the way that we do and continue to do education is structurally very, very similar to the way we did it 50, 60 years ago, right? And so it's like, we have instructional minutes that we've got to meet. We've got curriculum and standards that we've got to cover. We've got a grading system that we need to use that creates opportunity and doesn't. We've got tracking systems around advanced placement and GATE. And it's, those structures are deeply embedded. And I think if our North Star is to really kind of prepare kids to be contributing citizens, good thinkers, problem solvers, they can work well in teams. That's really what society is demanding of kids right now, right? We have got to rethink the way that we do education. And it's the master schedule, the instructional minutes, the grades, the standards.
The boxes.
I know that's like my pie in the sky, like that's my 50,000 foot, like where's the innovation in terms of the way we do school? And I just look at the little taste of it. I'm a little rebellious and like to kind of push up against the status quo. And so we try things different even within my organization. We have no defined time. People don't, it doesn't like start at 9 and end at 5. It's whatever your time is, that's, you get to decide on your own. Every employee has it. We have unlimited vacation. We don't define the number of vacation days that people take. We don't even have a work calendar. I'm not saying you have to work 260 days or 220 days. It's up to you to decide that. And so it's things like that to say, what would that look like? I mean, if we took that concept and put it in education, what would that look like, right? And I think what's interesting about these times in COVID right now is everything is disrupted. And what we're finding is a lot of this flexibility, what we focus on, we're just going to focus on connecting with kids right now, because that's like basic, like Maslow 101 type, you know. And so it brings us back to some of these core pieces. And for some kids, this is working well for them. For many, it's not. I understand that. But for some kids, this works. And so kind of breaking up the structures of education, whether it's a fiscal model that allows LEAs to do that, whether it's, you know, some of the constraints around teacher schedules and calendar or work days and some of those pieces, whatever it takes to really kind of break up and allow freedoms for the way that we do school, I think is a huge piece. The more traditional answer, yes. Do we need more time in teacher preparation programs in higher ed to be able to infuse and look at this intersection between social emotional competencies and academics? Absolutely, because that's not common knowledge. I mean, we haven't been taught that. So in higher ed, yes, there needs to be a focus on that in training preparation programs. And I would say even within in-service opportunities, when teachers are hired on with districts, there needs to be professional learning. And I think that's the easy obvious. But I would say the bigger piece for me is, you know, how do we do education differently in a way that allows this to grow? I mean, you look at a classroom, you hear a lot of like relationships are key and relationships are number one, you know, in classrooms. It's not just a feel-good piece. It's a lot of the relationships there are very transactional. The way that we do school, it's not a similar relationship to what you would have with someone else outside of school, right? And so the opportunity to learn the empathy, the forgiveness, the problem solving and working through that is harder in the way that we do school, of like 50 minutes, bell to bell, or, it's just tough. And so what would that look like if it was different? I mean, what if it was job embedded, or, you know what I'm saying? So I don't know the answer. My one word that I would kind of narrow that down to is like flexibility. What does it look like to do education differently in a world that's changing? Where, from a content perspective, I mean, information changes so rapidly. Why are we still stuck in the same content areas that we have right now? I mean, why? Is that really necessary? Or is it necessary to use different forms of content to be able to teach critical thinking skills, to teach teamwork? That's what's needed. In the higher ed space, that's one of the things I was worried about. I remember, I'll kind of narrow this down in a second here and wrap up, but when I finished my terminal degree, my doctorate, it was within a year or two where I was in a position to say, okay, now we want you to teach for university. I'm like, I was just in that seat. Like, what makes you think I'm going to be in this seat now? Like, master's or doctor level students. And, the one thing that really hit me was it wasn't about content, because that content within 5 years is old content, right? It's not about a knowledge piece it's about how do you process through? How do you teach people to engage with that? How do you teach the critical thinking, right? So they're the ones developing new content down the road, not just using content. And so that's the piece, like, how do we replicate that in education? So it's not so content embedded, it's content heavy, but really focused on skills. And I would beg the question, what does it look like? What would it look like if the measure of success for a K-12 system was 5 years post-secondary and you looked at employment? Or what if that was the measure? Like, what would that change what we do in K-12, right? We say that that's our goal, but really it's about college career right now. Let's get you to the next level, or let's get you in a job. But 5 years out, what would that look like if that was really the North Star? So it's just, I know, I'm a 50,000.
Flexibility, yeah. I picked on, I don't know about you, ATIBA, but I think everything that he just said about that, if there's an ask at the federal level, it is that flexibility, that policy change, because that's really where it starts. We get pigeonholed into certain areas, the boxes I kept saying, right? And being able to flex that in a way where, yeah, the measures, if we're really going to take a hard look at this, have to go beyond that diploma or that gate that's just opening for our students. It's not closing, it's just opening. So, Jon, I don't know about you, ATIBA, but it was so awesome to have Jon on our podcast tonight. And I want to, before we close out tonight, I have two quick announcements that you're going to all want to hear. And that is, I'm also going to be hosting an education conclave on January 20th. And the focus is going to be centered around language and literacy. And we've been hearing a lot about, mitigating the learning loss. So that's what we're going to highlight, the distance learning playbook. And so Doug Fisher, Nancy Fry will be in among other great, amazing educational leaders. So you're going to want to go to the ALAS website and check that out, because that's just around the corner. And the second announcement is that next week's vodcast is a special edition. And it's going to also serve kind of like a pre-conference chat. And we're going to talk about some recent data to discuss some of the learning gaps that we're seeing. And you know what, we're definitely going to use what we learned tonight, Jon, and embed it in next week's, because that's the stuff that's going to help us to get better at what we do. And for that, we want to thank you. Thanks again to Dr. Jon Eyler, our featured guest, and of course, my co-host, ATIBA-WEZA.
Thank you very much. Good night. Okay.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.